friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And we are two lifelong friends with a combined 25 years of experience working and teaching on Wall Street, here to give you the skinny on high finance and all of the elite career paths out there. We are the fastest growing female finance podcast. And today we're here to talk about the female side of the business. But don't tune out if you're a guy, because everyone's like, oh God, they're going to be talking about women's issues. This doesn't apply to me. Bullshit. Okay. This is actually one of the most powerful, important conversations that we've had to date. And that's why we fast tracked it to release it as a midweek episode, because of all of the topics we have discussed thus far. This is the one that we have heard the most urgent feedback from our social media community about. And that's the topic of female managers.
Yeah. I think there was a question in one of our Ask Me Anythings, and someone said, like, who are your best mentors? And we were like, they all happen to be men. And we were flooded with people who were replying more than we've ever gotten responses on anything ever. I'm going to say at least 200 replies.
It was
and
hundreds.
The weirdest thing is it was mostly women who were saying that the worst managers that they had were women. And that was A, very sad, B, surprising.
Yeah.
And I think it's just something that we want to talk about, because if this is an unspoken thing, then clearly there are problems and nobody is addressing them. So we wanted to try to just start a dialogue about, why is this? What are some of the things that are making that be the reality that people are experiencing?
And what are the solutions?
Yeah.
And we want to have a variety of perspectives on this topic. Our perspective today is the perspective of the two of us and two other women who both worked at Goldman Sachs kind of concurrently to our time in the industry. And so that's a very specific set of experiences.
Yeah. So both starting right as the financial crisis was unfolding. The 2008 Great Financial Crisis, or the GFC as it is now called by anyone who's
oh my God, it's
in
like
the
one of
industry.
those scary conversations when it's like, person comes back in a time machine and they're like talking to someone in 1922 and they're like, oh yeah, we just got out of the Great War. And they're like, oh yeah, World War II hasn't happened. And they're like, World War what? You're like, which great financial crisis are you talking about?
Yeah.
Don't tell me there's another one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we all have the perspective of low to mid-level managers. We're going to have a great conversation that we're going to air with the CEO of an investment bank coming down the line. And we're also going to be talking to—
who's also a woman, by the way, female
yes,
CEO,
with a female
and founder.
CEO of an investment bank. And we're going to be talking to women who are just coming up into the industry now in those analyst and associate positions, and even some who are in college who are just going through the interview and internship process to get perspectives across the entire spectrum of seniority, because I think it's important to hear from people up and down the ladder. So again, today is just one set of perspectives.
Yeah,
it's not the end all be all conversation.
Yeah. And the reason that we wanted to do this was it also happened to be timed with this, I think was it New York Times? No, or
the Wall Street Journal.
There was a Wall Street Journal article that came out about where are all the women at Goldman Sachs, or why are all the women leaving Goldman Sachs? Like, basically, Goldman Sachs has a women problem. And so we wanted to, again, talk to these two particular women, because guess where they started? They started at Goldman Sachs. So they have the perspective of actually having worked there to speak to the culture and how they saw it, why they left. And we talk about what were some of the things that maybe Goldman Sachs could have done to make them stay. Why is it that all these women are leaving? So it was not just the female manager thing that was timely in our lives, just because of that comment that we had made that happened to spark this whole controversy, but then also the article, it all kind of happened at the same time. So we're like, all right, we got to talk about this. We got to talk about this week.
And before we get into it, I do just want to catch up quickly on what I've been watching this week. I have been watching Summer House, and it's timely. We're going to talk about Summer House in this episode, and I don't want to give away why. But one of the things that you touched on, Kristen, was kind of the Mean Girls dynamic that was present in Summer House in previous seasons.
Yeah.
And I actually noticed in this season that there's much less.
Yeah.
And I do think though, it's one of these chicken and egg things, because sometimes in female friendships, it's really easy to talk to your friends and be there for them when they're going through a tough time. But people aren't necessarily as supportive and whatever when things are going great for you and not for them.
Yeah.
So right now I'm noticing on all of these episodes that Paige and Amanda, who previously used to ice out Lindsay, are oh, we so appreciate that you were so honest with us and talking about how tough things are with Carl. And by the way, Lindsay is a total tire fire. Like she is clearly just trying to get Carl to break up with her and sabotage this relationship, whether subconsciously or consciously. But like these girls are only nice to her when her life is like visibly falling apart. Yeah. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic too of the, okay, your good friends are the ones who are not just there for you when stuff is going badly, right? But the people who are there for you when things are going well. And I think that's another thing we don't talk about enough in female friendships.
Yeah, because back when we first started watching, I got like so triggered by some of those early episodes because Paige comes in, and I actually like Paige, but when she's in the dynamic with these other girls as a group, they were awful. You saw this dynamic that I'm like, I feel like I'm back in middle school. And they were so awful to Lindsay that I'm like, I like Lindsay, even though she's kind of crazy, but I mean, you kind of feel for her too.
I objectively disliked Lindsay the first season, but then you're right. But so that we are emblematic of the problem. It's like we like Lindsay because she's the underdog and the victim. But we didn't like her when she's like so confident in her train wreckiness. We're like, no, be less confident in your train wreckiness and then we'll like you better. Right?
Well, it's like Stassi and Vanderpump in like the first season. But again, she was super mean and she was kind of awful to everybody. Right. And then when people ganged up on her, she had to crawl back and like ingratiate herself, tail between her legs. Yeah. And you're like, oh, okay. You're remorseful. It's almost that arc of like when you're on top of the world. The fall again, if you're being mean though, like with the fall from grace and then the coming back. But she also kind of humanized herself. Then there was the controversy that happened in 2020, which is a whole separate thing.
This was all before that.
But before that.
Who was the OG of this was the first season of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Do you remember Camille Grammer?
Yes.
Camille Grammer.
You're such a liar, Camille.
The most hated woman on reality TV for a year. And
for those of you who don't know, she was married to Kelsey Grammer, who was Frasier in, I don't know if any of our current listeners have actually watched Frasier. I used to love Frasier.
Well,
he started Cheers. Okay, fair. Cheers.
That's
and
where
then
the character
Frasier.
Frasier Crane came from. It's funny you say this. This is totally unrelated, but I saw this meme on the internet and it was like, how different people look at different ages in the modern era versus the previous generation. And it showed a picture of Kelsey Grammer as Frasier Crane in Cheers. And they were like, he was
looks like he's
27 years old. And I showed that to my husband because I was like, don't I look good for almost 40? Like, look at what Kelsey Grammer looked like when he was 27. And he was like, there's no way. And we like went down the rabbit hole of looking up Kelsey Grammer's like birth date. Oh, 100%. 100%.
Well, it's like George Costanza was another one that they were looking at him and he's like 36 and he looks like he's 50. I'm older than Costanza was in Seinfeld?
Thank God for Botox. But yeah, I do think it's this very common theme of women. And again, I don't want to make generalizations about all women, okay? That's going to be a theme for today. Do not take this podcast and be like, they think all women. It's never all, right? We're just talking about our personal experience. And Kristen and I did not have it easy with female friends when we were growing up in elementary and middle school, and Kristen for you in high school. So this is just our personal bias. It's not like we don't like women. We love women. Hello. We are a podcast. But I think that one of the things that we're trying to get at today is, what are the drivers of this apparent problem of lack of female managers in the investment banking industry? And what are the solutions?
It's like lack of really good female managers. There are some amazing female managers. And in our conversation with one of the female CEOs, she talks about how she had like a absolutely amazing female manager when she was working in investment banking. So we're not saying if you're a female manager, you're not great, but there are certain things structurally that make it harder if you are a female manager. I do think there is some self-selection where some really good females take themselves out of the industry because they decide that that's just not what they want to pursue. And I think that that is less common in the men who have been successful. Like I see a lot fewer men deciding they're killing it in their career and they're going to take themselves out. Jen, you talked about how you were at the peak of your career and decided, you know what, I'm going to leave because it's not conducive with the family or the lifestyle that I want. There also are the actual just mechanics of having a child and then needing to feed them if you want to nurse, and like the extra layer of just pain in the assness that gets thrown on your shoulders to continue. I do think women sometimes take themselves out because you just get to a point where you're like, I've had enough. I can't anymore.
Yeah, I think this is a really important conversation for everyone in the industry, not just women, but men too. Because guess what, men? If you're entering the industry nowadays, the odds that you are working with and for women at some point in your career are pretty darn high. So understanding their perspective will behoove you in the interest of furthering your own career as well if you don't have a deep understanding of the female perspective. So let's get into it.
Awesome.
We are joined here by Nikki Boulukos and Carissa Jordan. They are the co-founders of Benjamin Talks. They are two extremely experienced women in the industry who both came up through investment banks and have now exited to found their own company. And we're actually here to talk about something that was brought up on our social media. So before we get into it today, here's a little bit of the background. Kristen and I were asked a question by someone in our social media community, which was a totally innocuous question, but I think they knew that they might be starting a little bit of a dialogue when they said, hey, listen, did you ever notice a difference between your male and female managers when you were working on Wall Street? And Kristen and I discussed it before we posted our response, and we simply said, yes, we did. And in our experience, our best managers were male, and we left it at that. We got hundreds, if not thousands, of responses, mostly from women in the industry saying, not only were my best managers male, but I had an overwhelmingly negative experience with female managers. And we were absolutely blown away. I thought that this was, this is me and Kristen, sample size 2, just sharing our personal experiences. And there's an entire community out there that has very strong feelings and personal experiences that they wanted to bring to bear. We're not going to tell all of their stories today, but we thought it would be really meaningful to have a thoughtful dialogue in a public forum about what our experiences were, why there might be a problem here, and what potentially the solve is for that problem. So Nikki and Chris, I'd love it if you could just quickly introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your background and bio, and then we'll get into it.
I'm Nikki Boulukos, and I went to undergrad at Harvard, studied economics and psychology. I also did some coursework at London School of Economics and accounting at MIT. My junior year, I interned at Goldman Sachs in sales and trading. It was the summer of 2008, so a very interesting time. I obviously left before it got really crazy, but I was lucky enough to get a return offer. Fast forward, I started on the equity research sales desk in 2009. I stayed at Goldman for almost 4 years on that desk. And then I actually moved out to San Francisco to do my first startup, again, on the business finance side, raising capital, doing operations, things like that as we built. And then came back to New York, met my husband, had 3 little kids, moved out to the suburbs, reconnected with Carissa. And we share obviously a lot of the same passions. We also have overlapping kids in terms of age. And that's kind of how Benjamin Talks was then started. And we can get more into that later. And I'll let Carissa give her background.
I'm Carissa. I'm the brunette of the crew. So my path was a little bit different.
There's one of us in each pair. Yeah.
A little bit different than Nikki's, but ultimately we got to the same point. I grew up in Queens, New York from a very blue collar working class family. I went to Hofstra University with the intention of then going on to law school. Worked at a law firm my freshman year, absolutely hated it, switched my major to business, actually secured an internship during my freshman year of college at a fund of funds on Long Island. So I would work 2 or 3 days a week, and then I'd go to school, take the full course load the other 2 or 3 days, depending on the semester. I met a bunch of people in the alumni network. I was able to get an interview for GSAM, Summer Analyst Program. So that's the asset management arm of Goldman Sachs, different from the sales and trading and investment banking side, which we'll go into later. I interned there going into junior year. It wasn't really a great cultural fit in terms of like the pace of it. I really wanted to be where the action was. Applied for sales and trading, mobility, did the whole super day, got an internship in sales and trading going into my senior year of college. This was the summer of 2007. I rotated in a product group. It was actually special products marketing. So CDOs and all that jazz. And exactly.
I don't think anyone cheers normally when you say CDO.
Yeah.
Only because I started my career in CDOs in 2007.
Well, the only reason why I actually got that first spot as my rotation is because when I was interning at the fund of funds during junior year, I was actually on the CDO squared desk. So not only CDOs, but CDOs squared.
You're making CDOs out of CDOs. It's like Leverage
I
upon
haven't
leverage
heard the
upon
term
leverage.
CDO
Yeah, and I
in
actually
15
remember-
years. Oh
I
my
actually
God.
remember my job was to go over all the various tests and go through the monthly docs. And I remember one of them, it like tripped one test, and I go over to like one of the senior. And I remember I was a junior in college, like
Yeah.
and I go over to one of the senior guys on the team, like, hey, this is failing this test, and it's getting close to failing this test. And he's like, yeah, it's fine. Just throw it on the desk. And I remember like, okay, it's fine. It's great. It's great.
You
It's
were
fine.
patient zero for the global financial crisis.
So my first rotation was on special products marketing, then in mortgage trading, which this was July of 2007. So there was one point where they were like, interns, get the bleep off the desk.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And then my last rotation was on investment grade credit trading. And that was
Wow.
ultimately where I got hired. So I started in 2008. Spent a year in investment grade credit trading, more specifically in the financials pod. So really ground zero of the financials crisis. So we were trading CDS and bonds of Lehman, Fannie, Freddie, Wachovia, WAMU, you name it. Saw it all. After a year on investment grade, they moved me over to high yield trading. I ultimately spent about 5 years at Goldman. I moved on to JP Morgan Private Bank to work as an investor associate. So really managing the investments of the ultra high net worth and high net worth individuals. I spent some time there, got pregnant with my first, decided to take a career pause, met Nikki a few years later, and then we launched Benjamin Talks. So it's kind of like the quick and dirty.
I love that. The other part that I love is, Nikki, you went to primo target school, and then Carissa, it was like a slightly harder path in. You guys ultimately
Just
got
slightly.
to the same place.
There was a little bit of focus of trying to broaden the pool of applicants that they were recruiting from, but it really wasn't as top of mind as it is at some firms today. I know that some firms in the financials industry are really trying to push to broaden that scope. But back then it wasn't. I remember I'm sitting down next to two sales guys and they're like, what school are you from? I go, oh, I'm at Hofstra University. And they're like, Hofstra? We don't let anyone from Hofstra. And I was like, oh my God. Okay, well, you let me in.
So segueing into the meat and potatoes of our conversation today, there was an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal and then a subsequent follow-up on Bloomberg talking about Goldman Sachs's women problem and how there is this power vacuum of women at senior positions, that women are leaving at an alarming rate. And we wanted to tie that into the conversation we initially set out to speak about female managers. And just to be clear, none of us are going to name any names here. This is not a conversation designed to besmirch anyone's reputation. And I also want to say too, that taking this opportunity to reflect on who I was as a low-level female manager at the time on Wall Street, I don't think I was a very good manager. But I'd love if you could share with us your experiences of different mentors you had in the business. Who were your best mentors? Who were your worst mentors, and why?
Yeah, so actually just walking it back to, even though I was a target school, and Chris has heard this story before. And again, I would just caveat this with, this was 15 years ago. So I know that things have changed, obviously, hopefully, but particularly in this area. In order to get my interview for the Super Day, I played soccer at Harvard, and I was finishing at the locker room. I was like going to head back across the river. And there's this huge reception set up in the hall in one of the athletic buildings. And I'm like, what is that? And like, everyone's all dressed up and whatever. It's all dudes. And I'm like, what are they doing in there? And I like open the door, and there's a huge banner. It's like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, meet and greet, right? But it was only for the male athletes. And I'm like, well, I want to work in finance. Like, I'm going to go. So I walked in, and this actually leads to who becomes my mentor, who's still a mentor now.
Good on you.
But I walked in, started talking to people. I obviously knew a bunch of the undergrads, and started talking to an alum who ran a desk at Goldman, who played hockey at Harvard. He actually coached me through my whole interview process, got me the Super Day. Fast forward, I started my rotation on his desk. He ended up being my first mentor and actually my best mentor. But that just kind of leads to, there weren't as many women in the industry, and at the time,
or none in that room,
in that room, and being the only, only female in that room, particularly. And then actually going to my Super Day, I wasn't interviewed by a single woman, and I had
really.
I was just thinking that,
and that just came to me when we were talking before this. I'm like, wait, the only female I met was from HCM. And they did kind of like the fit intro when they just talked to you about what
Human Capital Markets.
Human Capital Markets, sorry. HR, sorry. The acronym.
No, you're fine.
Fancy way to say HR. So that was really the only female I interacted with at all on my super day, which is kind of crazy.
I said this to Jen after the fact. I was like, my best mentors were male. But by the way, in sales and trading, actually, surprisingly, I did have a couple people. The worst person I worked with was a VP. But then when I went into converts, there was not a single woman at the associate level or higher. When I went into project finance, not a single woman at the, actually, period. There was not a single woman. I was replacing a female analyst, but there was not a single woman at the associate level or higher. In financial sponsors, there was one senior MD who actually was lovely to work with and like went out of her way to be a mentor to me and actually Kate, who we had on our podcast. But I just never really worked with her. I wasn't staffed on deals with her. So my issue is I literally had only one person who I worked with. And again, she was a toxic person, but like there just weren't female managers. By the way, there were toxic men too, but it was just a lack of women, period. And I know that was not your experience, Jen, but it's crazy to me. And I do think it was because the roles that I tended to get attracted to were much more technical. Converts was technical. Project finance was technical. And so there just weren't women there. But
yeah, I mean, we were just chatting about this before, and then I'll pass it over to Carissa. But I ended up on equity research sales, much heavier female presence on the equity floor than the credit floor. And then you go to mortgage floor. I mean, there's varying levels of how many females were around. I would say I actually had particularly one great female manager that I still keep in touch with. She actually just moved back to our town, that I told you about. But she really looked out for me. And even when she's left since then.
Yeah.
She took a big job. She runs a desk now. Even when she left, would reach out to me. Hey, do you want to come over to my new spot? Like she was awesome. But again,
say more. Talk
more
about
present.
Why was she so good when you were working with her?
From probably my second week on the desk, she started involving me with clients. So she would say, I'm about to call this client, pick up and listen to how I do this.
Yep, listen on mute.
I'll never forget this. We were doing the IPO for Tesla. And it was probably, I was on the desk maybe a month and a half, 2 months. She brought me to a meeting with Elon Musk and a client. And so I literally, my first 2 months on the job, I'm sitting in a room with Elon Musk and like talking about, so it, she really.
So it was the exposure she gave
me.
you.
It was
despite
the exposure.
Your relative juniority. She was like, the only way you're going to learn is by doing. So come do.
Especially, and I mean, you guys have talked about this on other episodes, when you're coming from a liberal arts background, like unless you're studying finance, particularly at Wharton or wherever you're going, you're learning by doing. At least in my case, I did not have that skill set. So for her to be like, okay, you're capable, you can pick this up, I'm going to take you along with me. It really made it exciting for me. And also I was able to kind of get that skill set and get up the learning curve more quickly, making it less intimidating. And it kind of all just built from there. And that was really a credit to her, I would say.
I really think that that's interesting. And it helps me view some of the mentors I have through a different lens, because a lot of my best male mentors had the exact same attitude. It was, come along, sink or swim. I'm not going to sit here and coddle you, but I am going to include you. You're always going to be on the phone. You're always going to be at the dinner. And the mentors that I didn't have a great experience with, some of whom were female, didn't include me, didn't give me that exposure, didn't give me those opportunities to prove myself. And I wonder about the motivation, because I can see wanting to feel, because you're never going to feel ready, right? No one's ever ready to pick up the call when the portfolio manager calls or when Elon Musk is calling, right, about the deal. No one ever feels ready. But since you're never going to feel ready, might as well try, might as well make some mistakes and learn from them. And I do wonder to what extent some of my female managers who did not give me those chances and did not give me that exposure were just like, oh, she's not ready. And I know if I weren't ready, I'd be nervous about doing it. So I don't want to make her feel uncomfortable, versus, well, she's going to make me look bad and I don't want someone else making me look bad. Therefore, I'm not going to give her that exposure. I have to wonder what their motivation was. And I will never know, right? But it's interesting thinking about it from the two different potential motivations and trying to understand what was motivating the managers.
I think there's a third motivation too.
Ooh, what's the third?
And I'm like a little bit more cynical. I mean, and it's fine. I think there's the third motivation is the tokenism, right? Like you are the token female. You need to hold your ground as you are the woman that they need to come to. And I feel like there is an unspoken competition, particularly on the trading floor among the women. It's like, well, I got this spot and I'm holding on to it. I'm the woman in the room and I want to maintain that role as the woman in the room and no one else is going to take that seat from me. And again, this is just me projecting, but there was definitely some women on the floor that was the sense I got.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well,
But I definitely felt that there was a little bit of that going on.
Well, and I also think that there was almost, and Jen, you had talked about this. I personally didn't really feel this, but that there was a little bit of competition. You were competition, not just because of tokenism, but just also like they might be better than I am. They might outshine me or whatever.
Well, I always had an imposter syndrome when I was working in the industry. I think when you feel insecure about your own level of performance and your own ability to do the job really well, and you see someone else who quote unquote checks the same box as you, even though that's not how it works. There is no, there's room for one woman at the table, because guess what? I was on a row full of women. There were women galore in all the roles that I was working
Binders
in.
full of women, Jen? Binders full of women?
Binders full of women. So, there should have been no scarcity mindset. And because I was less confident, no one should have ever been threatened by me. I posed a threat to absolutely no one. So that's really interesting to think about from that standpoint.
I think there's a level of competitiveness, particularly in a fast pace on the trading floor. I think you have to have some level of that just to even be in that seat.
That's why athletes thrive, right? That's why they love athletes.
Yeah, right. And I think that definitely extended to our male counterparts as well in a different way. In a different way.
See, I think, in trading specifically, there were very few women, right? Especially in fixed income. While on the floor, there were many other women. They typically sat on the sales side of the business, not on the trading side of the business. So I'll back up just a little bit because I think it's important to paint the picture of my story. I went to a high school that was all boys up until I was a freshman, and when they actually allowed in 200 girls. So the freshman class looked like 200 girls, 200 boys. Sophomores, juniors, and seniors were all boys.
Oh, so you were a pioneer at your own school.
I was a pioneer.
Wow.
Yeah. So the whole idea of being the only woman in the room, never really intimidated me. It actually pushed me in some ways. It was kind of a motivating factor to be the first, to be a trailblazer. I kind of thrived in those environments. So while I was interning on the CDO desk and I was the only woman there at the fund of funds, it didn't mean anything to me. I didn't view it in any way. Yeah. And again, I was 19, 20 years old. So I wasn't really thinking about what is my life going to look like in 10 years? Who am I going to be able to look up to and say, that's who I want to be in 10 or 15 years? Right. At that point, it didn't matter. So it didn't mean anything to me, right? And then when I was interning at Goldman, I knew right away that I wanted to do trading. In my head, I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't care if women don't get these roles as easily as men. I don't care if the options are limited. This is what I want to do. So I'm going to find the desk that's going to hire me, right? So that's really what it came down to. And throughout that whole process, many of the people I sat behind were men. There were women, and it was definitely an unspoken thing that they were trying to recruit more women to trading, particularly at the analyst
even
level.
When we were there.
Right? When we were there. They wanted that. They wanted to get more women in those roles. So it wasn't that a lot of the analysts couldn't handle those seats. A lot of the women didn't want those seats to begin with. They just wanted to go into sales. They didn't want the risk. So now you have this pool and, you're chopping it down to maybe 20% of the women who are even open to going into a trading role. And then it's finding the right seat. So I think once it was a known fact that I wanted to go into trading, HCM and all of the analyst recruiters were focused on making sure I got that spot in trading because it helped everyone. It helped me being in a spot that I wanted to thrive in, and it helped the firm. So throughout that process, many of the people I spoke to were men. I did interact with some female traders, but none of them were heads of desks. So they were VPs at the highest level, managing a book or a piece of a book or a small piece of a book, but they weren't managing teams. And then when I got to the trading desk in 2008, again, this was investment grade credit trading, there were other women. The highest level were VPs. I worked in a pod where it was 2 men, 1 woman, and me as the junior. And I loved working with all of them. They were all nurturing and cultivating in different ways. And again, this was 2008, where like no one really had the bandwidth to mentor a first year analyst, right? Yeah. But I will say they all did a great job of helping me as much as they could and have the capacity to help. And then when I moved over to high yield, there was one other woman on the high yield desk at that point. And then she wound up leaving soon after, and she was an associate. So again, she wasn't super senior. And we had a good relationship, but she had one foot out the door. She didn't see herself as growing in that role. So really, what kind of mentor are you going to be? So a lot of the interaction I had with other women who were senior to me were actually on the sales side. They weren't people I reported to directly. And I think it's interesting. I think some of them always wanted to have me in the room and bring me up along the way. And I think with others, they saw me initially as competition. And, you know, I still keep in touch with a lot of my old coworkers. And I was recently speaking to one of them, and he's like, well, it's not like you had any like women, like you weren't going to like call on so-and-so to kind of help you out along the way. Like it was a known fact, right?
Yeah. Really?
So I think that it's tricky. I think that for the most part, at the younger level, we all kind of try to stick together and help bring each other up. I remember when I was kind of in charge of intern recruiting, I was really focused on finding women who, again, wanted to be in these seats. And I helped hire someone who I'm actually having dinner with her later today. We're good friends still. And I wanted to see her succeed. I didn't care if she was better than me, right? I wanted to see a woman succeed and do great things and be successful and nurture them as much as I could along the way. But again, I was at a junior level too, so I only had so much capacity in that role. It kind of goes hand in hand to what we're saying, but I remember being pulled into a room by the head of credit trading and then on his superior, and maybe it was the head of the sales desk too, and they're like, Carissa, how can we get women to stay in trading? And I remember it being like, I was maybe about to get married at the time or not married. And I always wanted to have kids young. So that's kind of my story. So it wasn't necessarily, this wasn't necessarily top of my mind, but it was kind of there. And they're like, well, and I said, okay, so now I get pregnant, I have a baby, and I want a nurse. And I named one of the women who just had a baby on the sales desk who was nursing at the time. I said, well, so-and-so, I see that she leaves the desk 2 or 3 times a day to go pump.
Right.
If I'm in a trading seat, am I going to be able to do that?
Yep.
And they went silent, and they didn't have an answer for me. And while I loved being the trailblazer up until that point in my life, I felt like when it came to my family, I didn't want to be the guinea pig in that scenario. And I didn't want to have to make those really tough decisions when another life was on the line, all right? Or like it was really contingent on like how this is going to affect my family as a whole. That was kind of the turning point as to why I'm like, okay, I don't know if I want to be in a trading seat long term. And it really came down with what were my long-term life goals. And it was, I always knew I wanted to be a mom. And I always knew I wanted to be a hands-on mom. And I think that when those things started to come closer to happening is really when I started to think a little bit more critically on what I wanted out of a career.
Yeah, I think the nursing thing is people don't talk about this enough. I don't think people realize how much time it takes out of your day and your life to have to nurse. Even when I was teaching and I would have to go and stand in front of a room full of people and we would teach from 9 to 5 and I'd have a 1-hour lunch break. And we would give 10 to 15 minute breaks in the middle of the day. And I'm like, what am I supposed to say to a group of mostly men, by the way? Because it's like, like, hey guys, I got to go pump. I was very fortunate. Like I was able to get away with like going longer stretches. The physicality of wanting to nurse a kid and the time it takes to do that, like it's another full-time job.
It is.
And by the way, you have to clean the stuff. You have to store it. You have to like, it's this whole thing.
You're
and
bringing
it's
back,
like,
oh my God, the breast pump trauma.
I'm like, oh my God,
like,
systemic trauma is like,
I have not heard people talking about the toll that this takes when it comes to your career, because you now have a whole other job.
And I just think it's also like if you have a man who's in the leadership role, they could be so attuned to it, but they've never experienced it themselves that a lot of their responses are a little bit flippant. So it's like, well, you just get a baby nurse and then you nurse for 6 weeks and then you're done. And it's like no. Okay, well, maybe that is an option, but that's not the only option. And maybe that's not the option I want to choose.
Right.
So,
and
to be honest,
about the shaming that women get if you choose not to nurse, by the way.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
let's not
Right,
talk
right.
about how much shame there is for moms if you decide to formula feed, which by the way, like there should be no shame. People should do what they want.
I also think, though, that same flippancy comes from junior women looking at senior women, because junior women are told you can't get off the desk to pee. And then you see senior managers who are like, I can't go to this dinner because I've got my kid's soccer game or whatever. You're like, I don't understand. You just have the nanny take them, or you just have the baby nurse or whatever it is, right? You don't understand what it's like to actually be in their position, because also they're not, or at least in my case, they weren't talking about it. They weren't talking about what that meant. They weren't talking about what those choices were that they were having to make. So I, as a 22-year-old or 23-year-old, couldn't possibly fathom what it's like being on the other side, being someone with a family in that senior role, because there was no place for open dialogue about that.
I think that's such an interesting point, and I've actually been reflecting on it since we started having this conversation, how I would view a lot of the more senior women now versus how I viewed them right out of college would be completely different.
Completely different.
And also that, but no one's, like you said, just like no one's talking about the difficulties of breastfeeding. No one is talking about that. Like that line of communication just wasn't there in terms of what their decisions they're making and things like that. And that comes into being a mentor, right? Is having having
empathy.
Well, and having empathy
and being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
I can't think of one person in my stratosphere that was a mother of a child that was out of toddler years.
Oh, I
right?
did. I definitely did.
I did, as well.
So it was very different. There were two women when we combined desks who actually they had one of those shared roles, and I thought that was so cool. I was like, wow, this is a great path. This is something like I'll switch over to sales.
I'll that still exists.
Wait, so then I was like, I'm going to switch over to sales. I'll do a job share, and within 6 months of them having this, they both kind of
it blew up.
Left.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, okay, well, that's not an option, and I think there were definitely a couple of moms of school age children, but I had very, very little interaction with them. So again, it was like, what is the path? And there were some women who had different sales groups. In many cases, they were the primary breadwinner.
I would say that on my
in their
as
family,
well.
right? And my husband's in the business. That wasn't going to be an option for us. And I think that also played a lot into my decision to step away. And I always think of like, what if I stuck around? Like, what did my career look like?
Well, I was going to say two things. You were talking about like, what is the perception? If I saw people leaving early, because by the way, like you have childcare, your nanny needs to go home. You would see people leave and you're like, wow, like they're not working that hard, and it's like, oh no, by the way, they go home and now they are a butt wiper, like basically a servant to a tiny dictator. And I think a lot of people will be like, I want to stay at work because it's less chaotic, like it's actually the easier thing to do is to do the work versus go home and do all the stuff. But there is the expectation, especially if you are a woman, if you have two people in the industry, someone has to go home. And so there's sort of that part, which is like the perception of a woman not working as hard because they might have to go home for family. The other part that people don't necessarily talk about is the maternity leave in the US is awful. And then there is the comp part, because when you're working in finance, it's a little bit of a base salary and then a huge bonus. And so sure, you're going to keep getting your base, but if you take 3 months off, your bonus gets massively dinged. And that is very demoralizing. You're killing yourself and working really hard. And then, especially if you're in a P&L generating seat, you can see what you didn't earn. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to pay you down. You weren't here. You didn't earn that money. I think psychologically now you're like, shit, I just got paid down this year. So you're kind of like, these people don't value me. Like, frick this, I'm out,
One thing I want to touch on and get your opinion on, Nikki and Carissa. One woman who reached out to us is very senior on the buy side. And she said, one of the reasons that she suspected that when she was junior, she never had great female mentors was something akin to, Kristen, what you were just saying about how you work all day and then you come home and you work a second job if you are a mom. That even if you have a partner who stays home and you are the female primary breadwinner, or you have a partner who's also working and you have childcare, that there's something about women always being expected to be the caregiver in that role, to be the emotional support, to be the nurturing one, that their male counterparts may be going to work and have kids at home. And they're like, la-da-da, I'm at work, la-da-da-da-da, doot-doot-doot. They go home and it's like, oh, hey, kids, nice to see you. And then they go to bed and they do it all over again and rinse and repeat. And don't bear the constant emotional and psychological burden of being expected to be that primary emotional support system. And therefore, these women have limited bandwidth to then say, you know what I also want to do while I'm at work? I want to take under my wing this, baby giraffe who can barely stand on its own 2 feet, wasn't born an options trader, and now needs to learn all these skills from me, whose development I need to be focused on while I'm trying to keep my own head above water and think about these 8 other, and again, I'm not saying all men, I'm not saying all women. It's very tough to make those generalizations, and I certainly don't want to at the detriment of getting at the core of what I think is maybe potentially a problem here, that we just run out of emotional bandwidth. And we may not have, as senior women, the bandwidth left to say, okay, 21-year-old who doesn't understand what I have to go through every night when I go home, who by the way
probably looks down on me because I'm leaving early and thinks that I'm lazy.
Right, exactly. Or just has no concept of what this is. Like, think about your friends who don't have kids, right? And they're like, I'm busy. I'm tired. You're like, really? But it's not their fault.
Tired is? Right.
It's not their fault.
You don't know. And I think that goes to what we were saying before, is looking at it differently now. I mean, and even just thinking about the super days and people would come on campus and do 6 interviews. If I was still on the trading floor and I had 3 young kids like I do now, would I be like, oh, I'm going to go to Boston for a night and stay over and interview these kids? Like, no. You're just, like your bandwidth is only so far before you like totally collapse.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that definitely is a huge part, at least as I would reflect on it now, being on the other side of it.
I also think, and maybe this is just unique to my experience, but I think especially in the trading role, kind of that traditional female femininity was, you almost didn't want to show it, right? So, and I remember, this was something that still sticks with me today. Birthdays were never celebrated. And I was actually thinking about it. I'm like, well, when anyone got married, we never did anything. Like, if anyone was pregnant with a baby, we didn't do like.
Guys, you had such shitty culture on your desk.
Bridal.
I'm so sorry. The traders who sat in front of me were like, oh my God.
That is not what was happening on the equity floor, by the way.
No, and not on any of the tests I ever worked on.
Listen, we were celebrating different things. And honestly, I actually loved the people I worked with. Like, we had a lot of fun together, and we were like super smart, and we'd share books, and like we'd have like great conversations, and it was great. But I think some of the more like feminine touch and like the nurturing piece of it wasn't part of the culture, and it was almost like you had to be like a little bit tougher. But
I think that's part of the like I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think, and I didn't mind it, right? So like being in that role, I didn't care, because I'm like, I mean, Nikki could attest to this. I'm not always
the birthdays
I'm not a girly girl. Like, I'm also just not like, I'm not, when I always thought of myself growing up, Kristen and I, we've been friends since the 2nd grade. The general exposure that we had to other women when we were very young was not positive. Like, we were eating lunch alone in the stairwells because no one would let us sit at their lunch table because we weren't cool. Like
the mean girl. We were talking about Summer House, and I was saying,
so my first startup, I just have to say this because you brought up Summer House randomly. My first startup, my co-founder was Kyle Cook. Yes.
Oh my God.
He was my first co-founder. I have since, I love Kyle, but
so you co-founded,
there was no room for 2 blondes. Like,
so you co-founded Loverboy with Kyle Cook?
No, not Loverboy.
One of his other
startups. One of his other startups. One of his earlier startups.
That's crazy.
Fun fact that I didn't think we'd be getting into today.
It's funny, but I was going to also say, though, we were talking about Paige, who objectively, like, I like, but I just hated seeing how like mean girl she was to Lindsay in prior seasons. And I was like, I so relate to Lindsay because it's like a trigger, like mean girl stuff. I'm like, nah, like I will always.
I think it's just like you, just to this point, it's not specific to finance. Like I did my first startup was in the beverage industry. Let me tell you, the trading floor was a gem. It is so old school. I don't think it's specific to finance.
Well, and I want to come back to Summer House after we're done recording because I need to know everything. But one thing that you just touched on, Carissa, that I think is also interesting to think about. We were kind of that middle generation, and by we, I kind of mean me and Kristen. You guys are a little bit younger than we are, but
we're kind of all just right there.
Yeah, we're all just like mushed in together.
Elder millennials,
exactly. Yeah. But the generation of women that was mentoring me, some of them were wonderful. I really do want to be clear, but so many of them were first of their kinds. So many
Right.
of them were first head of this trading desk, first head of this sales desk, first. And I have a hard time putting myself in their shoes and thinking about, I remember something that a wonderful male mentor of mine said to me once when I was first started working for him. He was like, look around the floor and identify the people who are really successful and figure out what traits of theirs you want to emulate to get yourself to where you want to go. And that was great advice. However, I can see how that advice might not serve you if you are a pioneer in a space and you are a woman and you're looking around at all these men and saying, okay, what traits of theirs do I need to emulate? What if the takeaway is I need to emulate this ruthlessness? I need to emulate this competitiveness. I need to emulate this take no prisoners mentality. Because I do think that those were common character traits of the poor female mentors that I had who had come up through that generation. It wasn't, hey, let me be nurturing. Let me be kind. Let me be patient. Let me be understanding. Because those are all the classic female traits that you're not supposed to embody if you're going to be a successful woman in a man's business, if you subscribe to that mentality.
I mean, I remember the conversation we had with Helen Dian, and she was like telling us how her boss was like, you know, when I was on the trading floor, people used to like blow cigar smoke in my mouth. Terrible stuff. And granted, the person she was talking about happened to be like a teddy bear and was like a lovely person. But again, if your perception of that's like the first interaction, like, oh, you need to be a little bit of like rough and a bully and whatever, and not nurturing. That's the image that you initially might take away from that.
Yeah. I think the whole thing is very interesting. And especially given that really we were in our careers during a really specific time in the financial markets, right? Like it was very, very specific. I think people were stretched super thin. I think for, you know, that 2008, 2009 year, people were worried about their jobs. People were worried about their pay, getting promoted. Is my bank going under? The thought of taking on an analyst as like your mentee, no one has the capacity for that. Like
I
no
disagree.
One does, and that's
so,
okay.
I mean, I was sitting on the trading floor at Lehman Brothers when we went bankrupt, and I had male managers and I had female managers, and the male managers were like, I got you, girl. Wherever I'm going, you're going. I'm taking you with me. You're my team.
Yes.
We are in this together.
But I'm saying I agree with that. But like having that real mentorship, like, okay, you're on the
Like
desk for a
day-to-day.
month. You don't understand this. I'm going to stay an extra hour to explain this to you. No one had the capacity for that, right? Everyone was just trying to get through the day.
That's
and
fair.
I think that also I appreciated during that time, and I still appreciate today. So I think I'm very attuned to like when I started, what was actually going on. And I think the biggest takeaway that I have is that, yes, the mentors that I had and the people that I still keep in touch with and have conversations with and see are all men. And that's because there weren't senior women in those seats. And the women who were in those seats, most of them have left the industry. And I still speak to them. But we're not talking like we're at the same point in our lives as moms or as entrepreneurs. It's just a different relationship.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it was interesting when I would teach. The analyst class would be probably pretty close to 50-50. The associate class had significantly less women. Once people start working, it just continues to thin out. And I do think that when you do decide you want to have kids, people's priorities change. This environment is just not set up. Like as much as companies try to put in place mechanisms to get people to stay, especially if you have a partner who's in the industry. And not that every family is having kids, like a lot of people don't want to, but I do think that it's the child part that just makes it so much harder because there's everything that comes with that. You have another job. So I do think it's like a little bit of self-selection. Especially when you have to give 100% to your job.
And the finance industry was the first industry to return to work, right? From the get-go. Like some of those desks were never working from home, or if they were, it was very, very
you were penalized
brief.
for it. You were penalized for it if you
and now
tried
you're
to
being
work
brought
from home.
and now you're being brought back to the office. I mean, from our perspective, people that we know in the seats, like they're in minimum 4 days a week, if not 5.
Right.
And now you're a mom and you had a little bit of a taste of like what it's like to work from home and showing that like you could kind of do it all if given the right setup. And now you're being told you have to go back into the office 4 days a week. I just think, again, it's self-selection. That's not to say that some people don't want that. And that is not a great, wonderful path to have because it is. Yeah. But I think there are women who can't see that working for them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, especially when you have kids and they're only young for so long. But yeah.
You know, it's funny. I think we have two different threads here. One is the best mentors were male mentors because there were no women. And the other is the female mentors that were there were not great. And those are two different conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to dig into what solutions there are for the female managers who are out there in the industry now and the rising females coming up through the industry who aspire to be managers one day.
And want to be good managers.
Yeah.
Correct.
I mean, we literally had someone who messaged us who said, this breaks my heart to say because, again, I'm a woman and I plan on staying in the industry, but I haven't had good female mentors. Like I haven't had good female managers.
And
I would say my experience was different. And the female manager I was speaking about, she now has 4 kids and she's still running a desk. I would say instead of spending extra time after work with me, she included me during her working hours and all of her meetings and calls. And like include the younger women in what you're already doing. It doesn't have to be extra. And like you said, then they're gonna sink or swim, and that's on you as the younger analyst. But if you could include them from the get-go instead of making a barrier, I think that that's a natural way to encourage and have a mentorship that isn't going to stretch an already stretched person more thin, So
No,
I think that's
such a good
one
point.
solution.
what were things that the great male mentors that you had did that female mentors could emulate?
So I had 2 amazing male mentors who happened to run different desks. One was the trading desk and one was a sales desk on a different floor. Both of them weekly would introduce me to other senior people at the firm and
I
set
love
up
that.
like a coffee or set up 10 minutes, bring a coffee to their desk.
They
right?
facilitated
Like, a lot of people
networking for
They
you.
facilitated networking.
I think that's hugely important.
Yeah.
And that's something that a lot of my male mentors did as well, that none of my female mentors ever did for me.
Why do you,
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, why do you think that is? Do you think it's just they didn't think to do it? Do you think it was they wanted to maintain the relationships they had and they were worried that you were going to take them away?
Or maybe they felt like it was a bigger ask for them and there were more guys that were,
And maybe they weren't doing it
chatting.
themselves.
Maybe they weren't doing it themselves. I don't know.
Maybe they
that's a
weren't
good
natural
question.
networkers. I really can't speculate on why they didn't do it, but that was a very similar experience that I had with male mentors who are always like, I got to get you in front of this senior person. I got to get you in
Yes.
front of so-and-so, right? They knew
100%.
how to work the system internally. Whereas I had tangential female mentors who were not my direct, who weren't at the top of the food chain that I was directly reporting into, who would be like, come join us for drinks afterwards. You got to meet this other person or whatever. But it wasn't my boss being like, I got to get you in front of this person. I got to get you in front of this person, the same way that my male bosses did that.
had that
And I
same
think that's
experience.
a really, really positive way that you can contribute as a woman to a junior person's career by doing that. And because guess
Yeah.
what? Like you said, Kristen, the analysts coming in are 50-50. There are so many more women in these seats now. If you look at the list of MDs being promoted at these firms in recent years, there are a lot of female names on those lists.
The Goldman article from Wall Street Journal, they were saying you get the MDs, but guess what? They're not making partner and they're not then running divisions. They're not the heads of things. And then the ones that are decide to leave. Like that
Or they're
was the
not
problem.
revenue facing divisions.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. The head of legal, and I forget what the other one was.
Accounting,
but it was
accounting.
Yeah, it was accounting. They were getting promoted to MD, but again, they're not the heads of those revenue generating divisions.
When I think back, I never think about the female-female dynamic as being toxic. I think it was just not mature enough. And what I mean by that is like you're talking about a new VP and an associate. It's
Like
not
you were saying,
mature
Jennifer,
enough.
they're like
not,
the first in their seat.
Yeah,
right? So
or they're still like they're a new VP and they're trying to get that top client, or they're trying to, run a small team within the team, or eventually get the head of the desk. They're at the point in their career where they're trying to grow their own career. And that doesn't make it toxic. It just like, of course, who are you going to look out for first? Yourself. Right. And I think that's normal. I think that's human nature to want to look out for yourself first. So I think my experience was that there weren't enough women at the very top.
Who had no one to
Right?
look out
That's-
for
who, by
except
the
for the
way,
people beneath
that's
them.
And again, we've talked about how when you feel very confident in yourself, and you were
Yeah.
saying, Jen, like if you felt insecure, right? Like you just got promoted. And by the way, if people believe that you're getting promoted because you're a woman, right? Which
Mhm.
like there might be that worry that someone's going to think that about you. And I mean, look, we like Jen and I, we put videos out and people will be like, oh, you only got hired because of DEI. And we're like, dude, do you want us to go through our resume? Like, I don't care if I was a purple elephant. We had the credentials. I can't say we would have gotten the job. Like, there's a lot that's luck, but I will stack myself up, woman or not, against anyone else. We had the credentials. But there is still that element of people perceiving that you have gotten that because you are a woman instead of because of your merits.
Yeah, I wonder too, and this is a completely separate thought on the matter, but it came back to me as we're reflecting on our time. Someone described working at Goldman to me from like day one as, okay, well, people go to Goldman Sachs to then go on and do something else even bigger. People go to JP Morgan for a career. So
I
like,
mean, it's so true. So many of
some
my
of
friends
it,
are still
yeah,
at JP
like,
Morgan.
I mean, and that was like the common
Yeah.
culture of like,
Yeah.
okay, you're going to go to Goldman and then what are you going to do?
Yep.
Yeah.
Like, and it was, that was kind of the competitive culture. They're like, what can you do bigger and better and faster and like all these things.
So interesting.
Whereas on the flip side, someone's like, well, if you want a career, like go to JP Morgan. That was like always the thing. I don't know. I wonder if that's part of it too, where you're losing people when they get to a certain level because
they want
to do something
They
else.
can do
I mean,
something
I don't
better.
know.
Yeah.
It's the Goldman discount. You're taking
Right.
that discount
Yeah,
because
exactly.
you get the stamp of approval. Now you can go leverage that and go elsewhere, get something better.
Yeah. I want to go back to something that Kristen said. I mean, I remember this vividly. This is like one of those things that'll stick with me forever. And this was a peer, mind you. But a peer once said to me, how much of your success do you think it's due to the way you look? And this was at Goldman. And I remember being like,
Wow.
I was like, you're kidding me. Like, you're not going to put me on a desk that has P&L and risk if I can't even do a decent job, right? I have to be able to at least do a decent enough job. Like, you're not going to risk firm capital to a person just because they're a woman or they're the way they look, right? Like, you're not going to do that because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's firm capital.
Yeah.
You need to protect that. Yeah. And I think there is a lot of that in the industry at all different levels. Like, they look at you and like, well, you're a DI hire. I felt a lot of it actually built on my like imposter syndrome, right? Oh, I'm the token non-target. I'm the token female. I'm like the token blue collar girl. I'm lucky to have this seat. And I felt like I always carried that with me to the point where I actually didn't really seek mentors outside of my little sphere. And I didn't advocate for myself enough because I think deep down I felt like maybe I really don't deserve this job. And if I don't deserve this job, how can I convince somebody else that I deserve this job and to like advocate for me?
In retrospect, when you think back on that, do you have the perspective of this was all in my head? Or because someone said that to you, are you like, that was how I was perceived?
You know, I don't know. I think it's really hard. In some ways, I think when you look back, I'm looking back through it like rose-colored glasses. I think when I was in that seat every day, I felt like I'm lucky to have this seat.
Yeah, I always felt like they're going to figure me out. They're going to know I'm not supposed to be here.
I'm
Someone's
not
going to
that
haul
smart.
me out. Yeah.
I'm not that smart, right? And
yeah,
I remember
that's exactly how I felt.
And I think then when I stepped away from it, I would look back, I'm like, these dudes, they all just repeat each other, right? Or they read something in the journal and they regurgitate it and they add in their own vernacular. But like, it's not their unique idea. Most of them, I mean, some guys I work with, brilliant, completely brilliant. Most of them were just regurgitating what somebody else said or like what this hedge fund guy said. And they were just sitting at the table at the Tuesday meeting and saying what this top PM at a hedge fund said, but saying it as if it was them. And I would never do that because I was like, well, I don't have this unique idea, so I can't sit at the table. Like, you know, how many different ways can I talk about, you know, rental cars?
Well, also you were in trading and not in sales. Salespeople, I think, feel very confident taking someone else's idea and parroting it as their own. Everyone's a plagiarist, right? What is it, the old adage? There's a total of 19 plots in all of literature. Like, you didn't come up with this on your own.
Yeah, and I think now being, you know, an elder millennial and the stage of life I'm in, I could look back on it and say these things. But in that moment, I felt like I was definitely the imposter. And I was lucky enough to have that seat. And in some ways, I didn't advocate for myself and I didn't find mentors. So I do think that my experience with mentors is different. And it should be noted that.
Yeah.
What at the institutional level could have been done to keep you guys in this seat longer?
This is a tough one. And I actually think I wish I didn't leave as soon as I did.
Really?
I was treated very well and had a lot of mentors, and I got put on the women's steering committee right as like I was leaving. I thought if I stuck around longer, I would never leave. And if I didn't take this opportunity, so I felt like if I stayed in the seat so long because I saw it, female or male, then you don't leave. And I felt like, okay, if I'm going to take a risk, I've never taken a risk my whole life. Like I did all the things you're supposed to do. Check, 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 check. That if I didn't do it then, when was I ever going to do it? I didn't have kids. I wasn't married.
Right time to take a risk. You did the right thing.
Take a risk. So,
you even took a risk at the right time on paper. You were actually just following the script.
Don't take that from me.
Sorry.
It was a calculated risk. That was honestly the only reason I left. Before I had kids, I actually spent a lot of time back at Goldman. I thought about going back in the private wealth division because that was structured more entrepreneurial. You could spend more time away from the desk because at that stage I was engaged in like thinking about starting a family, all those things. And I remember laughing with someone who left and was coming back, and they're like, "We can be the poster kids for like the grass is not always greener." Like, yeah, you know,
of course,
you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that was such a personal choice of why I left that it wasn't really anything industry related.
Yeah,
it was more like my journey.
I think it's the same. It wasn't anything particular about Goldman or even, the culture the reason why I left. I think it was much more personal. So a few things. I left, it was 2013, and it was a really tough time to make money. And I remember like really struggling to like put up P&L with like my subset of names. And I was just like, well, this is miserable. I traded like the least sexy things ever, like Hertz, URI, Avis, Frontier,
Hertz
Windstream.
a big
like,
story right now.
Yes, agreed, but not that. Like, it was like, it was just like, they issued.
Come on, you were just 11 years too early.
Yeah, they issued 4.75% bonds. Like that was like what was going on. And actually, the culture of the desk was starting to shift. So when I first started, the P&L was driven primarily by trading CDS, credit default swaps. That was that was Goldman's bread and butter. Everyone knew that. That's how we made our money. And there was a dramatic shift to be more real money friendly. So real money, when you think of real money, those are your pension funds, those are your Fidelities of the world, your BlackRocks of the world, your ETFs of the world. So we need to trade like more cash bonds. And I think that the way that we were expected to make money was changing. And I wasn't able to really come up with any creative ways to make money in that seat. You add that on with the fact that, okay, like I was married at this point. I wanted to start a family because I wanted to have kids young. So I'm not really making money. I'm not really enjoying this. This is really hard. I want to start a family. And by the way, my best friend the week before, like just told me like I'm a complete ass because I remember talking to her and I would talk to her a couple of times every week. And one day she's just like, Carissa, yep, there you go. I got 5 minutes of your time and now you're off in your own world. And I remember that really stuck with me. And I was like, you know what? I'm like really becoming like not a person that I love and not a person that I like anymore. And I think I need to have a shift. And the opportunity at JP Morgan came my way. I was like, you know what? Let me try this out. I always wanted to go more into the wealth management side anyway. I have this opportunity. In my head, I'm like, this is going to give me so much more flexibility. I could be a mom and do this job and it's going to be great. So I think it was just a combination of all those factors. That's like why I left Goldman. And then I actually got pregnant a few months later. My life dramatically changed. I had complicated end of pregnancy. My doctor is basically like, this is your story. So however many kids you want to have, this is what your pregnancies are going to look like. And I was at a point in my life where I was like, JP Morgan is a whole other conversation. It wasn't a good fit for me, the role I was in. So I decided to leave. And I remember being really down for like the first year. And I was like, maybe I should just call up people at Goldman and like try and go back. Like, I don't know, like maybe like that's what I need. So much of my identity up until that point was like Carissa Peluso, Goldman Sachs. Like that was my identity.
You still remember from open meetings. Did you guys have open meetings at in your internships? They used to put all the interns in a room. That's why you say it like that, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're still scarred. Like you probably have nightmares about this. So they'd put us all in a room, right? And and actually we're talking about right before we got on with you guys, there was never once a woman who ran an open meeting. So open meetings were weekly. And as an intern, you just dreaded them. They would go and you'd all sit in a room and they'd cold call you. And actually further than that, there was one point they'd be like, who didn't go to an Ivy League school? Stand up. and they'd give you a question. Or they'd be like, who went to Harvard here? Oh, you think you're so great? Stand up. Can you name all 50 states? It was like
well, obviously I have 50 nifty memorized, so I got that.
Yeah.
But this is like a nightmare from watching like those things of law school where it would be like, you know, have you ever seen like those depictions
It's like the
of law
cold
school
call.
where you get cold
It's the
called out,
exactly.
like,
It's the
on a
cold call
case.
method or whatever. So they would do this weekly so that they could see who would handle pressure, and they'd kick people out of the room. They'd kick you out of the room if you didn't get the answer right. They'd say, go find someone on the floor who will tell you this answer, and then you can come back.
And you would have to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so sorry.
As like I fucked up in the open meeting. You need to help me now.
Anytime you got called on or would answer,
it was your name,
your
plus
name,
your school.
and then your school. That's what you'd have to say. Like at the time, I'd be like Nikki Rhodes, Harvard University. Like that so when she says Carissa Peluso, like
Goldman Sachs,
that was like whatever. So
like
wow,
it's like ingrained. In
no,
you.
the Goldman Sachs was like when you answer the phone.
Oh, you had to,
but
anyway,
like
same
the
thing.
The whole thing. And I feel like that was so much of my identity that there was a point where I was like, I should just go back. I'll figure it out. And then a lot of the people that I admired were starting to leave, and I was like, you know what? No, I'm not going back to work for so and so. Like I'll go back to work for the other one, but not for that one. And I think, you know, it's interesting. I think that there are points in my life where I look back and I like really miss it and miss what that felt like. And I will always be grateful for my experience and my time spent on the trading floor. I think it's invaluable. But I'm also happy where things are now. I mean, we would have never, like, we were friendly at Goldman, but we weren't besties.
Yeah.
How did you guys like how did you guys come together? I forget. I think like
did you screw up in the same open meeting?
No, different years.
Nikki's a year younger. She likes to make sure everyone knows that. I'm the older one.
Goldman was very social as well, at least on the sales and trading side. And they really encourage you to spend time with people at the firm. I feel like a lot of my best friends, even now, are women that I met at the firm. And a lot of them actually were in credit. So when I moved to Cold Spring Harbor, Carissa had already moved out here. We had met at Goldman, but we weren't like, Bloomberg each other. Like we weren't chatting. You know, so
it was just, and then I remember Nikki came over and remember Russie and Colette were like babies.
Oh yeah. Probably Nikki, 6 months or 9 months old.
Nikki's second and my third. They're now 6, by the way. And we're in the yard playing and we were just talking and we were talking about Goldman and life. And it was like, well, what do you want to do next? And we're like,
what are we doing next?
What are we doing? We kind of jive. We should do something. And we started talking about like, what are you passionate about? And it was like, financial literacy, which is so random, by the way.
Nobody even knows what that is.
Nobody even knows that. And we're like, and we just spent 6 or 9 months just thinking about like, where's their white space in financial literacy? And it was like, okay, how do you speak to your kids about money?
Yeah.
And then that's kind of what launched us on this path to Benjamin Talks.
I really am excited to talk about Benjamin Talks, pun intended. But by the way, I'm also impressed. That was the most productive conversation that I think anyone's ever had at a kid's play date before. I feel like every time I try to have a conversation at a kid's play date, I'm like, hey, how was your, hang on, put that down. Like, no, let go of him. Like, and we have like 3 words.
When you're like, my second and her third. Like it's one thing when it's like, oh, we'll do a play date and we have like little babies and they're a few weeks old and it's like, oh,
you put your stroller together and you get to go chat.
You might as well like have like a little potato or like a like the pet plant or whatever that you would like have. Like that's what like a
chia Tamagotchi.
A chia pet. Yeah. But when you have like the older ones that are doing God knows what, like they're just like chaos agents. I mean,
well, I mean, we're lucky. Our oldest are like very
similar personalities,
and they're like pretty calm. And
they're oldest children.
Then it all goes. Yeah, they're oldest children. Then it all goes to shit.
Yeah,
I get it.
I mean, those 6-year-olds.
Yeah, birth order is real, by the way.
And the rest are chaos demons. I totally understand.
1,000%. Yeah, birth order is a real thing.
Well, it's actually funny because I remember another game I'd like to play with myself was like going around like what birth order was everybody on the desk. I always thought that was like really interesting.
Can you sniff us out? Do you know what we are just by talking to us?
Outliers?
No. Usually people are like, I can smell that a mile away.
Birth order for you guys.
Yeah. We're not related, obviously.
Yeah. Jen, you're a second. You're a second.
No, I'm only child. I'm a wild card. Yeah. But then people are like, oh, yeah, I see that.
I feel Kristen's probably the oldest.
Yes, I am. I have one younger brother. Yep. What are we doing, you guys?
So I'm the third. I have an older sister, older brother, and younger brother. I'm one of 4.
Nice.
I'm the oldest of 3.
Oh, nice.
To give you a sense of my
I'm
two
one,
children
so.
with their Benjamin boxes and how they've used them, my oldest is asking about interest rates, and my youngest
That's
was
great.
like, "Mommy, I've decided I would like to take everything in my spend box and go to the toy store today." And this was day 2 of ownership, so
Yeah.
it 100% tracks with birth order.
100%.
So in all seriousness, we are going to have you guys back on. We want to dig into both of your roles and your experiences
Yeah.
because I think our listeners
We
have a
don't
lot
have-
to learn about that actual product space, both on the equity sales and trading floor. We have literally never had anyone come in and talk about equity sales and trading. So that's
Jen
absolutely
and I
huge.
were like, we don't know what people do in equity sales and trading. Like, I
And I was
dark pools? Is that a thing?
I was saying to Carissa, actually, when we're talking about like equity 101, I want to have she was my college roommate and she's still in this space, but she was in equity research sales, but at RBC for a long time. Her role versus mine, even though we had the same title, because Goldman was so deal focused.
Yes.
Like 80% of my day to day was deal flow. Like,
okay, you got to bring her on. We got to get both of you guys on.
Whereas like she was like pitching stock, like it was so research driven, like, it's like
Yes.
the earnings call for whatever. And I'm like, the earnings call, I have like 3 IPOs. Like it was just so different that it's
you were
basically
marketing new
bank-
origination from
Yes,
ECM,
correct.
and she was doing
ECM.
secondary
because
deal
our
flow for
bankers
institutional
were
investors.
because we were book runners, because the banking division was so wonderful,
Was so strong,
We
yeah.
got so many deals
it
and
would
so
always be
strong.
like Goldman versus Morgan Stanley, especially
Yeah,
on
exactly.
any
Like
tech
who's the
IPO.
lead? Like who's the book runner? Who, whatever.
Yeah,
So
who's
we
lead
were.
left?
Yeah, exactly. So we were just really involved in a lot of deals, and so we spent a lot of time there because obviously it was very lucrative.
I will say it was always funny because it was always like the fixed income people always thought we were so much smarter than the equity guys.
Yeah, because our stuff
and
has
then the
duration and convexity.
Yeah.
They don't know.
Yeah, and then the mortgage
They're just
guys
up,
were
down.
like the mortgage guys believed that they were like literally the smartest of them all.
Oh,
I remember,
right, because they're like,
sitting on
we
the
have
mortgage
options.
desk and wanting to like be a trader. And I remember at one point they're like, you're just not math smart enough to be a mortgage trader. And you went,
Oh my God.
I know. As like the intern, you're like, oh, I definitely can't. I'm not smart enough. I can't. I'm
You're
not smart enough
intimidated
for
by
this. Like you're so intimidated by it. If somebody's telling you you're not going to be able to understand this, right? So it's like it's so.
You're
it's
like,
so
oh, you must know, right? Like, I guess so.
I'm
If you
like,
say
yeah.
so,
I'm like,
yeah.
Totally. You
I feel like
totally
they-
get what you're doing.
But yeah, we fixed income people are such snobs. It's like things are upside down here, right? Price up, yield down. If you think you can hang. But guys, thank you so much for being brave enough to come on and have this conversation and speaking so frankly with us. I think this is such an important topic. I really hope that both men and women out there listening are taking away lessons in how to be a good mentor, how to be a good manager. And I hope that young people coming up into the industry are learning something too about the type of managers and mentors that you should be seeking out, but also about having empathy for people who may not be the best teachers for one reason or another at a certain point in your career, and figuring out how to work with those people nonetheless. So we can't wait to have you guys back on. Congratulations on all your success with Benjamin Talks. And we're going to talk about that next time that you guys are on. And
Thanks for having
and we
us.
just really appreciate you.
Awesome.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Guys, bye.
Bye.
All right, I'm going to hit stop.